Trans activists are putting autistic kids on a pipeline to transition them. I'll be your host, Sven Sharpen, for today's episode of Sharpen the Narrative. My friends at Colorado Principal Physicians wrote an article last weekend about the Autism-to-Trans Pipeline. And before I go over that, I'm going to go over my own research first. So Rita George and Mark Stokes conducted an analysis that concluded that about 69.7, so roughly 70%, of autistic people claim to be something other than straight, with about half of it being trans. And this was before COVID, so I'd argue the number is higher than this, probably around 80. So that means that up to 80% of autistic people claim to be gay, lesbian, or trans, which they tell you is a good thing, but it's really a tragedy if you really think about it. So let's just look at an example of what this looks like. So let's just look at an example of one of these queer autistic people. So we have a post called Queertism that actually predates COVID. Ted Rogers, I'm queer and autistic. How autism and queerness teach us how to find the rainbow in a black and white world. I was diagnosed with Asperger's during a stay at an institution aged 17. Although at the time it gave reason to a lot of my struggle, it seemed a fairly useless thing to pay attention to. And at the time, you didn't even know what it meant. But then you decided to identify as queer anyway? Thanks to an experience and journey, I have a greater understanding of what this means. Okay, that's a lot of red flags. Autism has taught me huge amounts about my queerness and how I've been able to use models of queerness to free my autism, give space to feel ecstatic, comfortable, and valued and productive. And it gets even worse than this. Autism is so queer. Okay. Does this mean that I, a man on the spectrum, should have to cross-dress and be put on estrogen? Because if you say autism is queer, that's what it's going to end up. That's where it's going to end up. And I'm going to show you exactly why I say that. Because if it weren't a possibility, I wouldn't be saying it. I was given drugs while I was in kindergarten by doctors who thought that that was the only solution to help me with certain behaviors and the idea that autism causes permanent bad behaviors. And this was done against the will of my parents. I mean, my mom was kind of manipulated to believe it, but my dad definitely pushed back on it. So I wouldn't put it past them to put estrogen on someone like me for a similar misconception around autism being queer. But the strategy for now seems to be emotional manipulation, and we're going to see how this turns out in a bit. So several studies that my friends have researched concluded that trans-identifying individuals are, quote-unquote, 3 to 6 times more likely to be autistic. It's quite a common citation, actually. And that 11% are autistic, though, again, I think the number is a lot higher than this. Another study by Corbett et al. Found that 7% of autistic people think they're trans, with 14% of autistic women that don't admit to being women. Again, the numbers are probably worse than this. I'd say it's up to 40%. And for women, it's even worse. And the Tavistock Clinic in Britain found that about a third of the patients that they were going through had autistic traits. And others would say it's like that was just the quote-unquote moderate to severe autism. That doesn't even mention Asperger's, so it's probably worse than this, even though autism is only like a couple percent of Britain's entire population. And this just shows the real numbers of trans identification in autistics is likely a lot higher than what's currently being purported. Oh, and it gets worse than this, because autism advocacy groups, besides my own that I'll talk about later, have all been infiltrated by trans activists and are basically just trans activist networks at this point. ASAN, for example, did a joint statement with the National Center of Transgender Equality, which is really just the globalist center of transgender supremacy, which is what I'm going to call them from now on, and the National LGBTQ Task Force, which again, I'm going to call them the Globalist Trans and Queer Task Force, because that's really who they are. They did a joint statement and promoted something called Autistic Trans Pride, which is just the most abominable thing you can think of. Like, it's just so obvious they're targeting us and they're not even trying to hide it. And I said this 2 years ago. Of course, the Autistic Women's Network, that's not a women's network anymore. They put non-binary in the title and they advocate for quote-unquote neurodiversity and trans liberation. Like, why don't we focus on autistic women and not men who pretend to be women? Can we just not do that? And of course, unsurprisingly, Autism Speaks is in on all of this too, claiming that trans procedures are quote-unquote life-saving and that, quote, 70% of autistic trans people, unquote, lack such procedures. And several hospitals, such as Children's in Seattle and Children's National in Washington, D.C., have literal, second gender facilities dedicated to autistic folks. And at Children's National in particular, it's people aged 3 to 25. So what, 25 years old is considered a kid if you have autism? Because I know there was a really heartbreaking story of a kid that was transed after his girlfriend broke up with him, and he was kept there past the age of 18. So that just tells me more of what we need to know. And they've even gone as far as to say that autism and gender dysphoria are the same thing and should be given the same treatment. So this could mean that if you're diagnosed with autism, you're going to be given trans treatments. God forbid if this finds its way in the school system. Can you see now how they're going to say that someone like me should be put on estrogen and put in a girl's school uniform? Exactly. That's how they're going to do it. They're going to use a stupid made-up lie like that to do such a thing. And I'm not going to let that happen. Worst of all, irreversible transgender procedures have basically replaced what little non-abusive autism support there was. And the infiltrated autism support groups label any opposition to the trans treatment and, let's be honest, the abusive special needs treatment too, as being ableist. So to convince autistic kids they're trans, all the aforementioned groups have to do is say that their autistic traits make them trans and that transition is the only thing they can do and that the reason they're struggling is because they're trans. We can't let this happen. Some groups like the Gender Identity Research and Education Society, or GIRES, have gone as far as to suggest that transitioning is a quote-unquote cure for autistic traits and an answer for being less conforming. So just because I grow up my hair, they would say I should transition. If you really add all this stuff together, you just get this pipeline of depressed autistic kids seeking meaning and identity and being rushed through transition procedures that they're eventually going to regret. Autistic detransitioners, many of whom I've become friends with and that I've met personally, they've told the world and even have told me directly that autistic traits made them vulnerable to this kind of manipulation, and they were fast-tracked to transition, and in a matter of a few years, they came on to regret it, especially in the case of Chloe Cole, who was the first one I met up with. So it's just really heartbreaking, a lot of these detransitioner stories, especially knowing that this is my people we're talking about. But the good news is that we do have groups that are willing to do something about the evil, and let's be honest, if it weren't for me, this probably wouldn't be as far along as it is. If that's happening, then I'm doing my job. GenSpect, Transgender Trend, and the CAS Review have all done studies on this Autism-to-Trans Pipeline. So GenSpect, Transgender Trend, CAS Review, among others, have all done studies about this Autism-to-Trans Pipeline. And I started talking about this to detransitioners 2 years ago, and I wouldn't be surprised if they then told the groups they worked with, which, again, that just means I'm doing my job. But the problem is these groups aren't really America-based. So they do have operations here, but they're not really in the United States. So that just means there's a lot of room for a autistic freedom network, if you will, in the United States. The real question is, how many more autistic kids, many of whom want to get married and have a family prior to when they were told the transitioning would be the only thing that helps them and made them happy and will solve all their problems, how many of these kids who want to have families and get married are going to be irreversibly sterilized and have their familial dreams crushed before we can actually go after this pipeline? This is a deeply personal issue to me as someone who has really wanted my whole life, as long as I can remember, to have a family and to get married to a beautiful wife and have many kids and do fun things with those kids. I know the abuse many autistic kids go through. I've been through a lot of it myself. I've heard from other parents what else happens. This trans pipeline that we've been put on is the absolute last thing we needed. And it's really what pushed me to even start doing my advocacy at all. It was the spark that lit the fuse of something I'd already been planning on doing for a long time. This was the final straw. What all this means is that we have to completely, and I mean completely, destroy this Autism-to-Trans Pipeline, arrest all of their operators, put them all in jail, life without parole, pass laws restricting irreversible trans procedures on minor children, which we're starting to do right now, and then pass laws that go after the rest of the child abuse autistic kids go through as well, because that too plays a big reason on why many of them end up trans, is because they've been abused. They grew up without identity, they grew up without meaning, and they grew up without treatment, and whatever treatment they get is always abusive. The truth is, these kids deserve so much better, and that's not even an overstatement. They deserve so much better. These are the brightest children in America. I've had parents tell me that when they go into a special needs classroom, they see the brightest children they'll ever meet, and they're just stuck in this room that they don't belong in. And so this is why I founded the Autistic Freedom Network, which will be linked in the description below. We are the first non-woke autism advocacy group in the entire world. And if you're concerned about what's going on with autistic kids and you worry for the future of autistic kids and, of course, our country as a whole, especially if you have an autistic kid yourself, please consider donating to us. It would help us a lot. It would get us a lot further along our journey, and we would be in a position where we could actually visit your area and give your kid a leader that they can look up to that is online. So an alternative to all the woke stuff that they're currently looking up to. Not only that, we will also completely annihilate the Autism-to-Trans Pipeline and save these kids from irreversible transition procedures and take them down the right path and teach them how to socialize, teach them what's going on with them, teach them what they need to do to grow up so that they can fulfill the missions that God has called them on. These trans activists, social workers, and politicians and schools and NGOs and other groups that have hurt so many autistic kids and almost hurt me, tried to hurt me, didn't work too well on me, though, because I'm still here and I'm going to keep fighting. We're going to show those people absolutely no mercy, because the great Adam Smith once said, "Mercy to the guilty is cruelty to the innocent." If we show the evil doctors and politicians and schools any mercy at all, that's just cruelty to the millions of autistic kids who, at least hundreds of thousands of them, that can no longer have families because they thought transitioning would get them out of abuse. That is what we have to do. We have to have some accountability. So until then, autistic kids are going to be stuck in this situation. But we're going to fix it, and we're going to start right now. God bless you all. That was this Sharpen the Narrative show. Thank you so much for watching. I've been your host, Sven Sharpen, and have a great day. Goodbye.